So thank you for that. Well, next I would like to welcome Dr. Indu Vishwanathan. Induji is the co-director of the Understanding Hinduphobia initiative, which was launched last year. And the focus has been to kind of expand the understanding of Hinduphobia from an academic perspective and develop a discipline around Hinduphobia as well as from a research and academia perspective, and really focus on how do we gain this maximum visibility for this phenomenon, because a lot of times people tend to deny this this word, but also this idea that Hindus actually experience Hinduphobia. So she has done some groundbreaking work there. We are honored to have her continue to be part of the programs that we have been doing for the past couple of years, but especially the Understanding Hinduphobia conferences that have been going on campuses under the sort of the Understanding Hinduphobia initiative, and educating all of us in different ways of how Hinduphobia impacts all of us, and really creating a framework of understanding Hinduphobia. So thank you and welcome, Induji. Floor is all yours.
Namaste. Thank you so much, Nikunji. And I just want to first start off with just as you reviewed all of the accomplishments of CoHNA, I really wanted to applaud and support all of the efforts that you have undertaken. I know that it's tireless work, and all of you are doing it on top of all of your other worldly and spiritual responsibilities. And so I just first wanted to just say that I'm very appreciative of it, because this is something new that's happening, I think, in this way for the Hindu American community. So just take a moment to appreciate that, and how I think that works so beautifully in concert with what understanding Hinduphobia is. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, you can see my slides? Great.
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, and I'll just say a little bit about my own background. So I've been in the field of education for over 20 years. I started off my career in economics and finance, but a few years into it, I decided to make the shift to become a public school teacher. I made the shift because I am Hindu, because the magnet in my inner compass points towards Dharma. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that. I wanted my life to be in service of something greater than my own ambition and my own intellect. So my career in education, it took a certain trajectory very early on. September 11th, 2001 was my 4th day of student teaching in a 2nd grade classroom on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I'm not going to get too much into that now, but I will say that living in New York during that time, working in New York City public schools, and learning how to teach social studies from a multicultural perspective as a Hindu changed how I looked at the world and my role in it. I've spent the last 20 years working in various capacities in education as a classroom teacher, working with Teach for Indiana Kanksha as a teacher educator in Bombay and Pune, and as the research director for Yes for Schools, a nonprofit that brings yogic practices of dhyanam and pranayama and asana to schools. Now, as an educational researcher, I focus on immigration and education. My research naturally incorporates the role that media plays in shaping public perceptions about immigrant communities and religiously minoritized communities like Hindus, and how this media impacts the experiences of those communities. While I was in my doctoral program, gaining all those skills and research and a much deeper and more complex understanding of American education, the Hinduphobic narratives in the popular press and social media amped up in a really big way. This is around the same time that I met my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Parth Parihar, whom you'll hopefully hear from later this afternoon. He brought rich analytical frameworks from political science and political economy, and together we began to unpacking what was happening in media and on campuses, and we recognized that we needed to do this in a much more methodical way within the academy. And so the Understanding Hinduphobia initiative was born, and so I thought it made sense to kind of start with an analysis of media today. So on September 9th, 2019, just over a month after the abrogation of Article 370, which gave displaced Kashmiri Hindus a hope of finally being able to return to their ancestral land, Furqan Khan, then NPR's Delhi producer, National Public Radio's Delhi producer, tweeted this: "If Indians give up Hinduism, they will also be solving most of their problems, what with all the piss drinking and dung worshipping." So let's take apart what's happening in this tweet. It's not that it's just rude or insulting, it's actually enlivening for Hinduphobic tropes. One is that Hinduism is irredeemable. In order to uplift or reform society, Hinduism must itself be discarded. 2 is that Hinduism is predominantly uniquely responsible for India's social ills. 3, that Hindus are backwards. The moniker cow piss drinker is not neutral. It was used by the Pulwama terrorist in his description of the Hindus he was attacking. And then 4, the worshipping of false idols and exotic religious practices. This goes back 1,000 years to the destruction of idols, of false idols, and the destruction of idol worshippers. Soon after this event, Khan resigned after claiming she was just being sarcastic in her tweet. This kind of dismissiveness of Hindus is a pattern in her social media and the social media of many Hinduphobes. A few days prior, she described the ethnic cleansing of Kashmiri Hindus as, quote, normal conflict collateral damage. NPR responded kind of tepidly to the harsh public criticism from Hindus. We were not satisfied with their response, as Khan's horrifically violent Hinduphobic tweet reflected a much larger and systemic issue of journalistic integrity in reporting on Hindus and Hinduism from NPR, both in India and in the US. So on September 11, 2019, I started a petition that was signed by nearly 10,000 Hindus asking NPR to, 1, investigate Hinduphobia in their staff's Twitter history, and to hold their journalists and employees' social media representations about Hindus and Hinduism to the same ethical standards as it has and does regarding other groups. 2, to investigate their biased practices of reporting on Hinduism and whether or not it meets the standards of ethics and fair reporting that they themselves apply to every other global South and minoritized community. And 3, to review who and what informs their assumptions about Hinduism and critically investigate their commitments and assumptions of their sources. And 4, to engage a more ethical and balanced approach towards reporting on Hinduism and Hindus. We predicted that advocating for fair and balanced reporting regarding Hinduism would be met with melodramatic and suspicious accusations about the petition supporters, and we were not disappointed. That our accusers were Indians with Hindu names was also equally predictable. However, it did make me curious about who was signing the petition. Why were they signing it? Were they really, quote, paid trolls looking to promote fascism in India? Were they really seeking to destroy any criticism or even the critics themselves? It's particularly, I think, poignant right now to talk about this on the heels of the attack on the assault on Salman Rushdie yesterday in New York. So I decided to analyze comments left by signers on the petition. This was my approximation of getting into the mind of the supporters. So I downloaded all the comments left on the petition as of September 24, 2019. These are all publicly available. So then I cleaned up the data. I took out things that were just like, I agree with this, or people's names. That left around 580 comments, and I analyzed these against these 15 categories. And each of the comments fit into one or more categories, and you can see the 15 categories right there in the chart in front of you. So the first 4 categories fall into the troubling areas that the Twitter critics were saying this is what the entire focus of this petition is. The rest of the categories pertain to either living as a Hindu, or were actually articulating specific concerns about Hinduphobic, anti-Hindu media bias. I'm making a point here of being very transparent about the methodology I used because there is a lot of unethical social media methodology that happens specifically around what Hindus are putting out on social media. So that's why I'm making a point of being very transparent about my methodology. These were the results. As you can see, the majority of the comments were concerned with NPR bias, about fairness in reporting, and about Hinduphobia. As I read the comments, other themes emerged that went undetected. So it should be noted that the majority of these concerns came from folks who identified themselves as current or former NPR subscribers. The most popular theme was that NPR reporters do not seem to be educated enough about Indian history or about Hinduism from an authentic Hindu perspective. They were unqualified to report on Hindus and Hinduism with any real context or authority. 2 is that NPR's biased reporting is contributing to a larger media phenomenon that is generating a sense of disharmony and divisiveness in India. 3 was overwhelming frustration, anger, disappointment, and unfairness at this media bias, at the gaslighting of Hindu genocides and religious colonizations of Hindus, the plight of Hindus in Muslim majority countries, skewed public narratives about Hinduism in India, and the ways in which this is impacting their lives, their children, and their experience as American citizens. 4 was frustration with the silence and inaction of Hindus in allowing ourselves to be abused and bullied by the press. 5 was calling for Hindu unity, to speak up and speak out. A lack of non-Hinduphobic Hindu representation on NPR staff. And finally, racism and Orientalism as a motivator for biasing coverage and concern and frustration that this goes largely unaddressed. I wrote an article on the findings, which I published on Medium. A few of us shared this article and other critical analyses of NPR's bias and the petition in an email to several NPR higher-ups. NPR's Senior Vice President of News, Nancy Barnes, responded, "Thank you for sharing your concerns about NPR and its coverage of Hindus and Hinduism. We take those concerns seriously. We always strive to be fair and balanced in our reporting. I've asked a group of editors to review the issues you have raised regarding the body of work produced by Ms. Khan and Ms. Freyer, including their social media accounts. We will also review the demands and comments made in the petition you have shared with us. This will take us a little bit of time, but I promise to get back to you as soon as we've finished our work and have a response. In the meantime, please consider me your point of contact, Nancy Barnes." This was September 30th, 2019. She still hasn't gotten back to me after I made several attempts to communicate with her directly. So much for point of contact. Before I go any further, I'm going to pause and share with you the working definition of Hinduphobia so that we're all on the same page. You can find this definition using the tiny URL on the bottom right of the screen. You'll also find on that site 14 specific examples of Hinduphobia. I'll be referencing some of them during this presentation. When doing this kind of work, it's really important to be transparent about your definitions, or you'll end up speaking across each other and possibly end up butting heads with people you actually align with. So our definition: Hinduphobia is a set of antagonistic, destructive, and derogatory attitudes and behaviors towards Sanatana Dharma, Hinduism, and Hindus that may manifest as prejudice, fear, or hatred. Hinduphobic rhetoric reduces the entirety of Sanatana Dharma to a rigid, oppressive, and regressive tradition. Pro-social and reflexive aspects of Hindu traditions are ignored or attributed to outside non-Hindu influences. This discourse actively erases and denies the persecution of Hindus while disproportionately painting Hindus as violent. These stereotypes are used to justify the dissolution, external reformation, and demonization of the range of indigenous and acknowledged traditions known as Sanatana Dharma. The complete range of Hinduphobic acts extends from microaggressions to genocide. Hinduphobic projects include the destruction and desecration of Hindu sacred spaces, aggressive and forced proselytization of Hindu populations, targeted violence towards Hindu people, community institutions and organizations, and ethnic cleansing and genocide. This definition was drafted by the scholars before the first Understanding Hinduphobia conference in 2021. Since it was first presented, it's been officially recognized by 2 universities by unanimous vote of their student assemblies, 1 city, and all major Hindu American organizations, including CoHNA, and it's making its way across the pond to the UK. It's also been used, as Nikunji mentioned, in a growing body of scholarship that's emerged through the UH initiative. So this scholarship is sitting across multiple disciplines, which means there are going to be articles in academic journals in multiple fields, including psychology, education, political science, sociology. So now that we've established the definition, let's dive in a little deeper. When I started talking publicly about Hinduphobia, it came after a period of recognizing a huge and growing gap between the ways I saw Hinduism and Hindus being represented in academia and media, and what Hindu people know about ourselves and our tradition, including what we learn from Hindu gurus, from mandirs, from Hindu scholars, and from the everyday Hindu. I saw this gap was maintained by gatekeepers who used morality as the reason for excluding certain Hindu voices, including Hindus from Kashmir, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Hindus who had witnessed and survived genocide and ethno-religious cleansing. You could see clearly that the gap was Hinduphobia. It's a massive gap, and it's been going on for centuries. So one of the arguments made by our detractors is that Hinduphobia is a recent term that has something to do with the current Indian administration, but this has been going on for centuries. The gap is held by these powerful people who claim that Hindus are not to be trusted as reliable or unbiased sources of information about Hinduism or Hindus, unless, and this is really important, we agree with what they're saying. The narratives about Hinduism these folks uphold often, or very much, depend upon stereotypes. So the thing about a stereotype is that it takes a small sliver of something that might even be true, decontextualizes that sliver, and then magnifies it to make it seem as if that tiny sliver represents the entire truth. And then when Hindus come and say, no, that's just a tiny sliver, you don't have the full context, we are accused of actually being anti-factual and being against the truth. So these distortions can be traced back all the way to our friend James Mill and the History of British India, which was published in 1818 and became the official training manual for British officers who were headed to India. According to Mill, Hindus were dissembling, treacherous, mendacious to an excess which surpasses even the usual measure of uncultivated society. So Hindus were far, far worse than your average typical sort of heathen society. Mill's job was to justify colonization, and he was highly effective. In fact, he became the CEO of the British East India Company. What's remarkable is that he never even visited India and didn't speak any Indic languages. What we observe is that today's discourse about Hinduism and Hindus from the academy and in media hasn't changed at all. It's just an extension of those exact ideas, and we're going to see more about that later on in a presentation. So we can think of these stereotypes as tropes. What are some of these colonial tropes? 1, Hinduism is superstitious and barbaric. 2, Hinduism is immoral. 3, Hinduism is patriarchal and misogynistic. But isn't there a long, rich history of Americans appreciating Hinduism? For instance, isn't yoga popular in the US? Let's take a look at the history of how yoga was presented in the US in the mainstream press. The narrative that Hinduism was ritualistic, immoral, and dangerous for women was amplified in the US, particularly in media coverage of yoga. Yoga has long been narrated here as a dangerous path towards barbarism and heathenism, stealing in particular innocent American women. This article is from the Washington Times, dated 1908. Mysterious yoga faith of East Indies, which has robbed an American citizen of a devoted wife. This article goes on to read, and she accepted, in the place of all this, a life of semi-barbarity among the mystics, the fakirs, and the dervishes of East India, whereas a devotee of the weird, intangible faith which is called yoga, she must satisfy her heart's desire in the contemplation of the occult. College campuses were particularly vulnerable. This 1911 article from the Charlevoix County Herald declares, joins yoga colony, educator's wife goes to follow strange god. The article warns that Mrs. Stone's entrapment in this cult led her to abandon her husband and child. It was taught that a complete fulfillment of, quote, yoga philosophy involved the separation from family, friends, and kindred. Mrs. Stone became a devout follower of the faith and left home. In this island where Mrs. Stone is supposed to be, its members are called sun worshippers. The common thread throughout these warnings is that yoga will lead innocent Americans away from their Christian God and their Christian values. Yoga's strange god steals wives, leaves children motherless, and leads to divorce. 100 years later, in 2012, we see the contemporary version of this through the protest against yoga in schools. In Encinitas, California, parents, quote, are in a twist over yoga, saying that adding the ancient practice of meditative exercise to the school curriculum is tantamount to religious indoctrination into Hinduism. The chief executive of the yoga studio replies, it's hard to know how to respond to someone who says, if you touch your toes, you're inviting the devil into your soul. In 2016, parents in Georgia are concerned that yoga in school endorses a non-Christian belief system. In May 2021, a 1993 ban on yoga in schools in Alabama was overturned, causing Christian conservatives to protest. It's significant to note that the parents protesting yoga in schools recognize that yoga is Hindu, while the schools teaching yoga contend that they have, quote, secularized it. In 2013, Judge John Mayer ruled against the protesting parents and in favor of Encinitas Unified School District. There's a lot more to unpack about the yoga industry and its relationship to American education. Not enough time for me to dive into it here. This should give you a glimpse into how troubling it is. If you're interested in learning more, I can share resources. For now, let's take a look at how this idea of secularizing yoga connects with Hinduphobia. Remember those 14 specific examples of Hinduphobia under the working definition? This is one of them. Erasure of the Hindu civilizational imprint, including the denial of Hindu contributions to specific histories, knowledge systems, geographies, cultures, culture, etc., and the superimposition of Western civilizational norms. How is it possible for Hinduism to be erased from something as Hindu as yoga? Hindus have called America home since the late 19th century, but according to the Pew Research Center, only 22% of Americans know a practicing Hindu. We make up just about 1% of the American population. Many of us are immigrants from India, South Asia, other parts of South Asia, and the West Indies. This makes us an ethno-religious micro-minority in the US. Most Americans don't realize that some Hindu Americans are religious refugees. Hinduism is very different from the three Abrahamic religions. For all these reasons, it's important for us to spread awareness and build bridges with other religious communities. Yet Hindu Americans are increasingly finding our religion, our institutions, and our identities under attack. The acts of congregating, being Hindu, celebrating our holidays, or sharing our perspectives about our own tradition, our basic First Amendment rights, being stigmatized by people in positions of power and influence to the point of demonization. If Hinduphobia is so clearly defined, how can we understand the discrediting of Hindu voices who speak about it? Miranda Fricker calls this prejudice testimonial injustice. It's important to recognize that systematic testimonial injustice has pervaded academia and media since colonial times. Non-Hindu scholars of Hinduism are still seen as objective compared to, quote, biased Hindu scholars. This is such an entrenched concept that you'll find some Hindus supporting it as neutral. Hinduphobia is normalized even within the Hindu psyche. Our initiative, Understanding Hinduphobia, seeks to abnormalize it. Part of this work is amplifying the testimonies of persecuted Hindus. During Understanding Hinduphobia 2022, Shravani Chowdhury shared her experiences of being a young Hindu child in Bangladesh during the 1971 Hindu genocide, when 2 to 3 million Hindus were targeted and killed, and hundreds of thousands of Hindu women were held captive and raped by the Pakistani army. She described how her mother gave her a bottle of kerosene oil and a box of matches to keep with her while she slept for 9 months, so that she could immolate herself before a Pakistani soldier could touch her. Her full testimony is heart-wrenching. All of these conference sessions are available for free on YouTube. How do academics systemically silence Hindu testimony about their own persecution? Here's one example. In July 2021, the South Asian Scholar Activist Collective released the, quote, Hindutva Harassment Field Manual, which was shared across South Asian studies departments around the country. The manual accuses Hindus of inventing Hindu genocide and suggests that Hinduphobia is an invention of the far right, and that Hinduphobia cannot exist as Hindus have never been killed or persecuted on a mass scale. That they can state this openly and with impunity speaks to how normalized Hinduphobia is. According to the producers of the Hindutva Harassment Field Manual, Hindus who speak about Hinduphobia are not to be trusted or taken seriously. Moreover, the head of the South Asian Executive Committee at Rutgers University, a publicly federally funded institution, tweets that the members of the committee all agree. This is despite clear evidence of Hinduphobia. In July 2021, NASA tweeted pictures of their intern cohort, which included a visibly Hindu student posing with images of Hindu gods and goddesses in the background. This was supposed to be a great moment for Hindu representation, but what followed was a barrage of tweets openly attacking the young Hindu American woman for her identity and her faith. Holi is a Hindu festival that we all know celebrates prosperity and well-being through community spirit. It's inclusive, with people transcending all boundaries to gather together to play with colorful powder. And because of this, it's often celebrated by Hindu students on campuses around the world. Holi Against Hindutva was started by Yale University students in 2020, along with support from outside groups, including the producers of the Hindutva Harassment Field Manual. The campaign began as a response to the Citizenship Amendment Act in India. While students have the right to protest anything they'd like, the group was exploiting a popular and sacred Hindu festival for politics. Groups like this claim to represent South Asian interests, but their target is always Hinduism. Facts are exaggerated and the truth is twisted to depict Hinduism as the fascist oppressor of minorities and women. Groups like Holi Against Hindutva use the pretense of political extremism to hide their real target, Hinduism. The stigma arising from relentlessly connecting Hinduism with political extremism is very powerful. Even though it isn't truthful, it can make students feel isolated and unheard, especially when they're living outside of their parents' homes for the first time. Hindu college students report feeling targeted, especially since so much of the mainstream curriculum conflates Hinduism with political tension and social problems. The graphic in the middle depicts actual names Hindu students and scholars, including all of us speaking today, have been called for speaking about Hinduism and Hinduphobia. Academic bias is rampant, our tradition is vilified, and Hindus don't have the spaces or the platforms to dissent or hear other points of view. They witness the mass consumption of educational material that reduces and disparages Hinduism. Many Hindu students are confused and in pain, especially knowing that their peers are being taught to despise what is most beloved to them in the name of academic freedom and social justice. For many, the only place to turn is a Hindu campus organization. But even these are under attack. This graphic, created by a Rutgers professor, is an example of how organizations working for the welfare of the Hindu community are targeted without any basis. These accusations, while xenophobic, are made under the pretense of standing up against intolerance and hate. It's routine to cast Hindu American organizations that educate the broader community about Hinduphobia, or speak about Hindu persecution, or advance the interests of our community as part of this collective dangerous overseas mission with the objective of taking over American public institutions, destroying democracy, and spreading hate. The same script played out for other minorities in the US many times before. Students have asked me, what do you do when you know people will believe a professor and not you? This question becomes all the more important because the words of academics and intellectuals carry a lot of weight. The constant, unsubstantiated vilification of Hindu Americans encourages broad-based disdain and scorn towards the wider Hindu community, which quickly manifests as Hinduphobia. Any attempt by Hindus to embrace our rich past and affirm our rich civilizational heritage become an issue, a problem, requiring urgent intervention because of the supposed looming threat Hindus and Hinduism represent. As a result, even efforts to speak for the Hindu victims of incessant persecution across South Asia become drowned out in this manufactured chaos of politics and propaganda. Accusing those who organize around or speak about Hinduphobia, including the persecution of Hindus, of being agents or pawns of violent, oppressive political agendas. Unfortunately, this is far from a one-off incident. The attacks on Hinduism and the Hindu American community are institutionalized within academia. Dismantling Global Hindutva, which Nikunji mentioned earlier, or DGH, was a conference held in September 2021. Its proposed purpose was to, quote, understand the complex and multifaceted phenomenon of Hindutva. The organization claimed that they were not attacking Hinduism, only Hindutva, which they understand to be a radicalized extremist political movement. Even if you take their definition of Hindutva at face value, the conference revealed that their target was more than Hindutva. Let's take a look.
Are the panelists saying that the caste system is inseparable from Hinduism? And if that is the case, then why not dismantle Hinduism and not just Hindutva?
Hindutva project is not merely the control of the BJP. Hindutva project is to actually spread the tentacles of Hinduism in every society.
These guys are corporate malignant Brahmins, as I call it. Sundarayar and Ramana Kompella. These last names, Ayers, Kompella, Trivedi, Sharmas, Mukherjees, and so on. They seem to be violent advocates of this kind of malignant Brahminism, which we need to talk about. So my question is, have we ever dealt with Brahminism and the connection between Brahminism, Nazism, in a lot more theoretical way? I also want to propose probably Brahminism played a very crucial role in the evolution of Nazism.
I take Hindutva as political Hinduism, not a distortion of some inherently benign religion, but a historical expression of it, with continuities in the works of Dayanand Saraswati, Vivekananda, Aurobindo, and Sarvakar. Even Gandhi.
Whatever may Hindus say, actually, it does not make a difference that Hinduism is a danger to independence, equality, and brotherhood. Thus, it is the enemy of democracy. The idea that Hinduism per se is harmless and only Hindutva is the culprit will not do any good to the observance of the lofty ideals, democratic ideals.
Without hesitation, that Hindutva is indeed inseparable from Hinduism, and arguments of Hindutva is not Hinduism are deeply dangerous, Brahmanical, and laced with erosion and violence.
When Durga Puja trends, hashtag Durga Puja, to trend hashtag Mahishasura caste oppression.
Hindutva is in fact Hinduism. We believe strongly that we must begin not by denying the Hinduness of Hindutva.
I did not at least hear anyone, definitely myself, deny the fact that Hinduism is deeply imbricated with Hinduism. Nobody on this panel will deny.
Oops. 1 second. Hold on. I have a little bit of a technical difficulty. Let me just have 1 second to share again. Okay. These are direct quotes from the video you just saw. It is unambiguously bigoted to argue for the destruction of Hinduism itself. It's undeniably xenophobic to argue that Hinduism, a religion practiced by millions of Americans, is a threat to freedom and democracy, and to label the immigration of Hindus to this country as Hinduism spreading its tentacles around the world. And when top universities lend their credibility and sponsorship to this conference, Hinduphobia is institutionalized. Worse, when Hindu Americans brought these concerns to universities, we were the ones called extremists. Unfortunately, administrators at some universities talked past our concerns and reiterated the conference's boilerplate claim verbatim, that the conference was criticizing Hindutva and not Hinduism. But we can all see that this is completely untrue. Bear in mind, the scholars at the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference still claim, without evidence, to be the vulnerable underdogs who are threatened for speaking out. This is an absurd claim and is handily debunked. On their own website, the conference boasts the sponsorship of over 60 elite accredited institutions, including ones funded by our tax dollars through the Department of Education. It is irrational to argue that the conference organizers, presenters, and supporters are speaking from and for a position of vulnerability when they are the gatekeepers of some of the most elite, moneyed, powerful academic institutions in the world. The question remains, how is their academic freedom threatened in any way when they have the support of so many of their colleagues? While they are actively and successfully delegitimizing and demonizing Hindu voices, censoring Hindu academics, and effectively erasing documented Hindu genocide and persecution with the support of genocide scholars. So what can we do as members of the Hindu community and allies? It can be helpful for us to think of ways in which we can synchronize our efforts by taking up different roles. We can look at the role of researcher educator. So the purpose of a researcher educator is to hold an inquiry stance. We examine phenomenon, archival text, discourse, media, communities, history, and situate those findings within the larger academic literature. We have generative conversation with other scholars. We teach students not only the content of our discipline, but how to critically interrogate the field and to examine assumptions, and we serve the community through educating institutional experts. We're going to hear from 2 such researchers next. There's also the role of advocate. The role of an advocate, which is a lot of what CoHNA does, is to be engaged within and with public and social institutions to shift perceptions and modes of thinking and working within those systems. They have worked hard to get and maintain a seat at the table. These advocates have specialized knowledge and training in how to successfully engage in systemic change. So they're not just coming in with facts, but they're coming in with a specific skill set and how to actually create systemic change, right? These are the people who work with politicians and try to address problems in a way that actually brings everyone together to solve the problem together, right? So an advocate is working with the policymakers, with the government officials, and in order to advance that type of systemic change, the role of an advocate is not just to speak, but to listen. And then you have activists. The goal of an activist is to get people to listen to them. They have this fixed idea, For instance, they want to see a specific policy change, and they don't often shift their own perceptions of, or they don't often shift the perceptions of the people who are in charge of these institutions. They function more off of public pressure, collective bargaining, et cetera, right? The system largely remains the same, even if policies change. And importantly, they operate outside the gates of institutions. And they can even use the fact that they're outside the gates of the institution as a bargaining tool, right? That they don't have a seat at the table and therefore they have less power. None of these are better than other roles. They're just very different roles. Sometimes you need something that's really acute and active and emotional like and noisy like activists. But if you want to see real systemic change, you need to be working at the level of advocacy and education and scholarship. So I'm just going to leave you with some final thoughts. Scholars in academia deny the documented genocide of Hindus and the existence of Hinduphobia, even while they're actively shutting down religious and academic freedom of Hindus around the world. The tropes that support these narratives are hundreds of years old. And at the same time, as you'll see from our scholars from NCRI, anti-Hindu disinformation continues to grow at alarming rates, matching patterns that have led to actual ground violence. That this rhetoric demonizing Hindus continues to grow across the political spectrum should be a red flag for everyone. At the root of this is understanding that the colonial era agenda, tropes, and logic of Hinduphobia persist to this day. What should be abundantly clear is that the freedom to practice Hinduism, to be Hindu, is under threat and has been under threat for hundreds of years. We have the tools to recognize and measure these threats, and it's up to everyone concerned with the principles that govern freedom of religion to listen, speak, and take action. We have the opportunity to take action before more violence and harm are done. I'll end with some words from the late Dr. King, which resonate particularly for me as a student of Advaita. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. If you'd like to know more, please do visit the websites of Understanding Hinduphobia and the Navigating Hinduphobia manual. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was certainly eye-opening. Every time I hear this presentation, I always learn something more. I do think we have a few questions. First one is, there's a really good question. Let me just go back. One of the questions was, as a Westerner, how can I sort of distinguish, how is it possible to recognize and address Hinduphobia as a Western person? I think this is a really important question, yes.
Yeah, I think there are a few ways. I think one, being in conversation, so testimonial injustice is a huge part of how Hinduphobia is advanced, right? And so I think engaging with Hindus who are speaking about this, engaging in conversation, I do think that the most powerful ways to be in discourse in conversation with actual Hindus who are just sort of everyday Hindus who are well-versed around this. Two, I would say to really understand why the definition is written the way it is. So to understand that each of those examples that we have on the website, those are real things that have happened and continue to happen to Hindus. And I would say prior to all of that is start off with really critically examining why you believe what you believe about Hindus and Hinduism, because we've all been, including Hindus, systemically taught to be Hinduphobic, right? That's the master narrative, is that the right history of Hindus is the one that's Hinduphobic. So I think just starting with the stance of humility, of, you know, why do I believe what I believe is a really important entry point. Then engaging with actual Hindus, learning more about and speaking up about Hindu persecution that's happening today. And when I say listen to Hindus, I mean listen to Hindus and believe Hindus. Don't just listen to us and discard what we're saying. I think it's through relationships and self-examination. I think those are really, really important first steps. And then, of course, engaging with and supporting Hindu advocacy and educational organizations like yours and mine.
Thank you. Very interesting. I mean, this question comes up, and it's not really a question, but someone's observation. And I've been asked this question many times, so I think it's important from your perspective. Why are people so afraid of Hinduism, right? This is a question, it's a very broad question, but I think I would like you to see if you had any thoughts of like, how do you
absolutely.
think about
Oh, I mean, people have been taught to be afraid of Hindus for hundreds of years. If you look at textbooks in the United States from the early 1800s, right, as soon as there were these efforts made to have American Protestantism be the thing that defines what makes a good American citizen, Hinduism, even though there weren't even Hindus living in the United States, then Hinduism specifically was used as a foil for what would happen if you were not a good moral citizen. So American citizens have been taught in school textbooks to fear Hindus and Hinduism, you know, for over 200 years. So, you know, the question is like, what about the people who don't? What has happened differently for them? Are they the people who've met actual Hindus? Because the default is to actually fear Hindus.
Yeah, and there are Pew surveys, right? 1 in, I think, 4 Americans barely knows a Hindu or something like that, or 1 in 6. I forgot what that was, but 1 in 4 or 1 in 6 is still pretty bad.
Well,
so,
and if you add to that, the testimonial injustice, if you add to that people are also taught not to believe Hindus, then even many of the people who know Hindus are not going to believe what we're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Let me see if there's any other question. So I mean, this is not for you, but okay, how do you donate to CoHNA? You can go to cohna.org and donate there. There's a big donate button. You can just press it and donate. You can also donate via Fidelity, your charitable trusts. There are different ways of donating. So if you're unclear, please send us an email at info@cohna.org. I think those are, let me just see if there's any other question. No, I don't think so. So we'll obviously have the breakout rooms and action items a little bit later. Okay, let me just see if there's anything come up.
There's one question I see about, well, it's more of a comment and then a question. The assumption that meditation is the Buddhist practice first and then a Hindu practice. Question everything you think you know about the separation of Buddhism and Hinduism. I would start with that question. We have to unlearn so much. Question everything that we think we know. I'll just leave it at that.
The other question was, what is the value of an interfaith dialogue where, you know, certain traditions potentially are opposed to a true interfaith dialogue with the dharmic traditions, right? So some of the Abrahamic traditions might be opposed fundamentally from like a dharmic culture or dharmic traditions or values, etc. What is the real value of such an interfaith dialogue?
Well, first, what's the downside? Could start with that, right? There's always benefit in engaging with people from different traditions. I think the more dialogue we have, the more compassion we have, the more we can understand each other's backgrounds and histories. I think it just creates the possibility for, I mean, this nation in particular is sort of ideally based on this idea of inclusion, of intergroup. It is an intergroup country. That's the premise of the entire, I mean, the premise is much more complicated and sorted than that, but in a I guess like the TV version of it is that, you know, or the nice version or the aspiration is that we are an inclusive, diverse community. So anything that's intergroup only helps create more harmony, right? And I would say as Hindus, we are firm believers in pluralism. So it is within our orientation to engage with people who have different ideas. It is not within our orientation to cut ourselves off from that.
Yes, that's how our ancestors did Shastrarth and, you know, other kinds of dialogues. Yeah, now the goalposts have shifted a little bit. It's more global, but yes, absolutely. And I think being there is really important. Thank you.
I think one of the things that we can really contribute to broader conversations around diversity and pluralism is that there seems to be this fear in the West that difference is bad. So everyone wants to make everyone get along by saying everything is the same. And we're not afraid of difference, right? Even within the Hindu tradition, you have people who, you know, during the day, they're having major debates around whatever, Advaita versus Dvaita. But then afterwards, they all go to each other's home for dinner, and you know they're not afraid of having different. There's not a fear of difference. Difference is not bad. We don't all need to be the same. All religions don't need to be the same in order for us to get along, right? So I think that Hinduism and the Hindu way has a lot to contribute to really expanding notions of diversity and pluralism and to creating harmony. So it's not just to advocate for our rights, but I think we have a real contribution to make to the goals of the country.
Awesome. Another really good question. As an educator of school children, can you speak on some ways you have exposed different discrepancies in the versions of textbooks of Hinduism and Indian history? And then what are effective ways to engage with children?
Yeah, so my first experience actually was when I was in 6th or 7th grade, and we finally got to the India chapter in school, right? I've been going to school with these kids since I was 4. I was a small grade. There were only 70 of us in the grade. And then like, I could kind of keep my Hinduism private. It was, I know I grew up in a very white community. And then all of a sudden it was like 3 pages on Indian civilization. And one of those pages was like, you know, you can imagine the dirt road with the woman in the torn sari carrying the thing on her head with like cows everywhere. And so I had never really, people find it surprising that I was very shy. I used to be very shy. And I just stood up in class and I said, this is not my India. And my social studies teacher at the time, and you know, this was the mid 80s, it was a different time, but he graciously said, well, talk to us about your experience. What is it that you would say? So there's a little bit of testimonial justice there, right? So I think, but that was because we had a relationship. You know, I had a good relationship with the teacher, and he was open-minded. So I guess, you know, I share that anecdote to say, yeah, there's a lot that's really misrepresented in texts and in classrooms. Having worked with teachers, I'm in teacher education, I know that the teachers teaching those things are not doing it because they have necessarily any malicious intent. They just don't know any different. They haven't had a chance to be educated differently, right? And so a lot of this really is about becoming a part of educational communities in a really proactive way, and not just showing up to complain, but showing up to support those communities in really meaningful ways, because we are a community that really embraces, and I mean, we worship education, we worship Saraswati, right? It's so important, so integral. We're an inquiry-based tradition. Even though most of our parents were educated in a rote learning colonized method, the tradition itself is inquiry-based. We embrace all the things that are that American education is heading towards. So we can actually be really valuable, powerful contributors to American education. So I think that's part of it too, is not just showing up to say, hey, you're misrepresenting us, but like, hey, what can we do to actually enrich American education at large? And also, by the way, you know, what you're doing is really damaging to our heritage. And I know you wouldn't want to do that. So how can we work together to change that?
That's a really, really important point. I think allyship and really getting involved. And that's what CoHNA is really about. So for those who are interested in these types of education related matters, K through 12, our Hindu Parents Network really does that. So check it out. You can get involved in HPN, and we try to help parents kind of really engage with the school administrators, and be a force of change locally, not just on curriculum matters, but also other things, as you had mentioned. So thank you for that.
The second thing I just want to add to that, Ninji, is just that I think also be very aware, you know, as you start to read and learn about Hinduphobia, there are a lot of materials out there. You know, it causes a lot of trauma and anger in the community. And there are a lot of materials out there that are written outside of these institutional spaces that can bring up a lot of strong emotions. But we end up reflecting the sort of diet of discourse, right? So if you storm into a school and you've read this really polemic literature, and you come in pointing a finger and angry, you might be justified, but Hindu anger is not just understood because Hindu persecution is not a part of the public consciousness. So nobody understands why we're angry. All they'll see is that you're angry. And so really, really making a point of being very thoughtful about your consumption of literature, of what it is that you're reading, and putting your attention on being effective and not being right.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we tell parents, that don't storm in like with, you know, guns blazing and say, you know, this is all so horrible. And, you know, no, relax, take a deep breath, and let's engage with the administrators, because most likely they're doing this out of not understanding. The second thing is also, they'll say, well, fine, okay, you convinced us now, but what can you give us to change? And then that's where everybody starts twiddling their thumbs saying, oh, we don't know. So you have to go in prepared both ways. So thank you for that. Last question for you is, how can mandirs get involved in this type of work? And how would that amplify the dialogue within the community? And great example today, we have a partnership with the United Hindu Jain Temples.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I just finished writing a chapter on the pedagogy of Hindu temple architecture. So I've done a lot of reading about Hindu mandirs and their historical role in society, right? So, you know, what differentiates Hindu mandir, kovil from the place of worship in Abrahamic traditions is that they're not just places of congregation, right? They are community centers. They have a social and spiritual role that extends beyond just people coming together for an act of prayer, right? And so part of that role, I think, really is engaging with the issues of the times. I mean, debates used to be held at mandirs. Mandirs used to give out microloans to support local businesses. They used to house seeds for farming in local areas, right? They were really, really important, significant, and thoughtful community centers. And I think if we can start to think of them as the mandirs in the United States as important contributing community centers, not just for the Hindu community, but to broader, thoughtful, dharmic discourse about America, I think that we can really not just represent our own rights, but we can be a place where they can become places that are identified as really valuable for broader American society. And then I would say specifically around this issue, you know, as I mentioned earlier, Hindu institutions and organizations in the United States are under attack. The attack that we see happening in terms of caste policy in tech organizations in Silicon Valley, that attack is going to be coming to, you know, mandirs. That's not being negative. It is going to happen. And there's a lot of work to be done with mandirs in terms of equipping them to be prepared for that, right? Because at least these corporations have discrimination policies at hand. They know the vernacular and the language and the norms and the codes of the business space. But, you know, even if Hindu organizations, even if mandirs don't want to think of themselves or identify as being political, they have been politicized. It's not because we have done it. It has happened though. And so I think we have to accept that reality and move skillfully around it. So I think to create a space to educate our community, to educate other communities, to be a safe haven for Hindus. And I would say especially young Hindus who are experiencing this in schools and in universities, not just in classrooms, but on campuses through campus movements like Holi against Hindutva. They need a place to come and actually learn, because if they can't learn about Hinduism at the universities because they're so biased, where are they going to learn about it, right? In a way that's actually really meaningful and directed towards them. So there's sort of infinite ways, I think, that Hindu mandirs can actually play a really important role, and must, because this campaign of Hinduphobia is coming to them.
Yeah, great point. And if you are interested, if you are a student again, and if you're interested in learning about Hindu Dharma and culture and traditions, I also invite you to join the Hindu Students Council. You can check them out at www.hindustudentscouncil.org. They have presence on different campuses where students can find a safe space to learn about their traditions, practice their cultural beliefs, things like that. So, but I want to include Vivek Gupta, who is actually the director at the UHDTA, to give his view on this point.
Yeah, thanks, Nikunj. This is a very valid question, and I think I agree with what Induji has mentioned already. All my points that have been covered by her already. So I would just add that Hindu temples traditionally and historically have not just been a place for worship. It's a place for where the art, where the dance forms, where everything has evolved and come to the being that what we have right now. So our whole history, somewhat Hindu temples have, in fact, not just a little bit, a lot of the support that the temples have given us throughout the history has been seen right now, what's in front of us. My concern sometimes is that people want to do stuff, but later on they fizzle out with their ideas. So I want to really empower everybody and tell them that we all are ambassadors of our faith. If we believe in, if we want to do it, you can come up with an idea to any of the temple presidents. You can write individually to me what you would want to do or work as volunteers, and we are always looking for volunteers, and we would connect you with the organizations or have some way or form and have these events or meetings such as Understanding Hinduphobia that we are doing with CoHNA. We can also do that. with our individual temples and with, in person as and when we go in person and get that going. The other thing I also wanted to mention is that sometimes when we want to do an actual work, nothing happens out of thin air, right? We need dedicated, smart people who are actually also contributing with money. So if you understand how things work in America, put your money where your mouth is, right? Kind of, or put your mouth where your money is, kind of thing. So I think it's very important that we donate to organizations such as CoHNA as well as other places who are actually doing good work. So if you have time, help with time. If you have money, help with money, and let's get this together. And regarding allyship, I wanted to just speak a little bit about the question that came about how can a Westerner or a non-Hindu help. Allyship is a big thing that we are seeing, especially in today's times. It has picked up because we are all one at some point, and then we are all supporting different movements that modern Americans are facing in our current role and in our current lives. So what affects one community can also affect another community. So that's why allyship is very important. You don't have to be a Hindu to support Hinduism and understanding Hinduphobia. You can always raise your voice first by understanding what Hinduphobia is, identifying where are the ways I could support with my time, with dialogues, with family, friends, on the dinner table. Those are some of the things in everyday's life that you can actually do. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that. I appreciate, again, we're going to go into the next session. I want to appreciate Dr. Indu Vishwanathan for joining us, and she's obviously going to be around, but this was a brilliant presentation. Thank you again. Next, I would like to welcome, let me just bring them in, Dr. Parth Parihar and Prasiddha Sudhakar. Dr. Parth Parihar and Prasiddha, both of them have recently done a great work on the historic anti-Hindu disinformation case study and report that came out from Rutgers University. So Prasiddha Sudhakar is the analyst, the lead analyst at NC Labs who wrote the report, and Dr. Parihar, he is one of the authors of that, and he's also a postdoctoral fellow from the Wallace Institute of Political Economy at the University of Rochester. So I wanted to welcome both of you. The floor is all yours to talk about this amazing historic study that has outlined so much valuable information for the Hindu community to understand. So please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nikunj and CoHNA, for inviting us to give this presentation. And our presentation will draw on a lot of the themes that Induji had already introduced in a specific case study on social media.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. Also, CoHNA, for inviting us for this presentation. As we begin, I actually want to start by saying thank you to all of the other co-authors of this report. So my advisor, Dr. Joel Finkelstein, who is the Chief Science Officer and Director of the Network Contagion Research Institute, John Farmer, who is the former New Jersey State Attorney General and Senior Counsel for the 9/11 Commission, Dr. Lee Jussim, who is another author and the chair of the Rutgers Psychology Department, of course, Dr. Parth Parihar as well, and former Congressman Denver Riggleman, who is a fellow and visiting scholar at the Miller Center for Community Protection and Resilience, and also a very special thank you to Dr. Indu Vishwanathan, the New Jersey Governor STEM scholars, Malav Modi, Kiana Purst, and Christian Ramos, who all worked on the paper together to do some kind of analysis. So a little bit about the NCRI and NC Labs. The NCRI is the Network Contagion Research Institute. The NC Labs is based at Rutgers University that has a training program with the Center for Critical Intelligence Studies and also the Miller Center for Community Protection and Resilience, and basically has very wide scale data ingestion from various social media platforms like 4chan, Twitter, Reddit, Gab, and we basically analyze that using natural language processing and machine learning to basically detect social media, cyber social threat detection and identification. So I'm going to hand it off to Parth to talk a little bit more about our research questions and also a taxonomy of anti-Hindu disinformation.
Yeah, so thanks, Prasiddha. So the main questions that we wanted to look at through our study of anti-Hindu disinformation on social media was whether there is a systematic or systemic structure to anti-Hindu hatred. So by analyzing a wide array of tweets, memes, different forms of digital media and social media content, can we deduce that there's some structure or underlying pattern to the ways in which people are relaying Hinduphobia on these platforms? How is Hinduphobia actually being disseminated? And if it's the case that we can actually deduce that there's this structure, can we prove this structure using quantitative analyses? The second question is whether or not Hinduphobia, the quantum of Hinduphobia, so the amount of Hinduphobia that we see on these platforms like Twitter and more niche platforms like Gab, 4chan, etc., whether the Hinduphobia on these platforms has increased, has risen in modern times, in recent times, the last 2 or 3 years.
Great, thank you, Parth. So what we began with this paper was really looking at open source intelligence collection. So this is an example of a meme that basically depicts Hindus using Happy Merchant. And Happy Merchant is basically this historically anti-Semitic meme that has been used against the Jewish community. And we see that the same tropes are basically now projected onto the Hindu community. But now Hindus are shown as these dirty and disgusting group of people where you see basically there's poop on this person's head. And this is basically to show how Hindus are these dirty and backwards group of people. Then what we found was very, very disturbing. On social media today, so this is a meme actually found on Twitter, basically showing Pepe the Frog, which has been used by the far-right white supremacists and several other extremist communities to openly depict violence against Hindus using Nazi-style imagery and basically calling for gassing Hindus. Then we found another meme basically showing the 26/11 Mumbai terrorist attack, and once again using Pepe the Frog and laughing about the violence that took place. And then finally co-opting the murder of George Floyd. This is from an Islamist extremist that basically wants to do the same to the Hindus. And we see these types of memes that have been circulating all over social media platforms. And so what we did is we actually wanted to provide a quantitative edge to the kind of violent memes that we were seeing. So it's important first to understand these 3 different platforms. So 4chan, Gab, and Telegram. So 4chan is basically like this vanguard of new subcultural memes and extremist communities that have really been operating on there. Whenever it comes to any kind of violent event that has taken place in our society today, most of the content actually can be traced back to 4chan. And Gab is another extremist community where Gab is another platform where other extremist communities have basically been operating. So for example, during the 2018 Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, the actual shooter had posted a lot of his messaging on Gab. And then Telegram is another platform where obviously not everyone who uses Telegram is a white supremacist, but a lot of white supremacist communities do have messaging boards where they use to organize and create some kind of action. So when we look at these 3 platforms, what we found is that certain slurs targeting the Hindu community were massively on the rise. So like I showed before with all of the various memes that were there, all of them were associated with this certain ethnic slur, which is Pajit, basically this idea of a Hindu being dirty, backwards, and disgusting, as I showed in the memes. And a lot of the more violent memes always had these type of ethnic slurs directed towards the Hindu community. So what we did is looked at time series analysis of this term on 4chan. And what we found is that these slurs targeting the Hindu community have been massively growing over time. And we could actually go back even as far as like 2019 or even before that, and we see there was hardly any mentions of Hindu or any kind of ethnic slur. But now as of 2021 and 2022, these slurs are massively growing all over social media platforms. The same is the case with Gab. Once again, massive spikes in anti-Hindu content and ethnic slurs that are targeting the community. And same is the case for Telegram. And so when we actually look at what is the type of messaging that is being talked about with Hindus, these are the type of messaging that comes. Hindus believe in drinking cow piss and shitting in the streets, which is incompatible with being human, Pajit. You are a Pajit, there are too many of you, 2 billion subhumans migrating everywhere, stay in your own shithole. This is the type of messaging that has been going on around Hindus on these platforms. And so what we see is that this is not only limited to more fringe platforms, and this type of messaging has actually come into way more mainstream social media platforms like Twitter, where actually anti-Hindu ethnic slurs have been at an all-time high. And here are some of the memes associated with that certain slur on Twitter. So you learn driving to flex, I learn so that I can run over Pajits, we are not the same bro, basically inciting violence against Hindus. And the one on the right is let's show this Pajit who is boss, basically once again using Pepe the Frog memes. And for those who may not be familiar with who groypers are, groypers are basically like these armies of white supremacist trolls that are followers of far-right commentator Nick Fuentes. And they basically are using these tropes against the Hindu population. So what we see is that Hinduphobia is basically, it's not limited to any kind of particular ideology or group. In fact, Islamists and white supremacist communities are both inciting violence against Hindus on these social media platforms. And what's really important to note is that behind is a flag of Kekistan, which is basically this idea of a white-only nation where all other ethnic minorities are not welcomed. So these are the type of anti-Hindu tropes that we identified on these social media platforms. Parth, did you want to comment a little bit about the anti-Hindu tropes?
Sure, yeah, definitely. So far, I think one of the main questions that we wanted to look at was whether there was a systemic structure to anti-Hindu disinformation that we were seeing on social media. And one thing that we can see is that this anti-Hindu disinformation is supported by a variety of different tropes about Hindus. So if you remember the first meme that we saw, the happy merchant meme applied to Hindus, we saw that Hindus were characterized as people who are dirty, disgusting, barbaric, smelly, inferior, and at the bottom of it, uncultured, uncivilized, and unworthy of people who should be interacted with, essentially. So that's one of the really major themes that we see. Another one is a complete disdain and a genocidal disdain of Hindus. So we see this here on this meme about Kekistan, right, where basically you have an army of Pepe the Frogs who are essentially suggesting that they will sow this Pajit, which refers in this particular case to Parag Agarwal, who's boss. But more generally, it's just a threat to the whole Hindu American community, or Hindu community really globally in general, that you're going to have pushback if you aspire to be in a position of power as someone who is even nominally Hindu. You can see that same sentiment expressed in the other meme where this guy is essentially saying that he's going to run over people who are Pajits, right? So you see genocidal disdain, and you see this idea that Hindus are inherently backwards, uncultured, uncivilized, etc. And we'll see a couple more tropes as we go through the presentation.
Exactly. And it's very important for us to also distinguish what is anti-Indian xenophobia versus Hinduphobia. And what we know is that with these certain ethnic slurs that are there, all of these are associated with Hindus in particular, as opposed to other religions within India itself. So we see basically very explicit Hindu imagery that is used in all of these memes. So it's not just about anti-Indian xenophobia. This is about Hinduphobia as a whole. And so what we did with this data from 4chan is we developed a topic network, which basically uses natural language processing and machine learning to basically clean, stem, and tokenize the data to basically then look at the association between words and then map that onto a graph. And basically the size of this cluster basically indicates its volume. And one of the really important clusters that really depict the anti-Hindu tropes here is this one at the bottom, where we see a lot of these tropes about Hindus being street shitters and subhumans and with way more offensive language, which I'm not going to read out, is basically depicted here of Hindus as these, once again, the same tropes that Parth mentioned before. And like I mentioned, this is not just about anti-Indian xenophobia. For instance, this is very explicitly showing a Hindu woman with a bindi. Again, basically giving toilet paper because Hindus are. And so who are the people who are actually disseminating this type of information on a platform like 4chan? What we did is then a location analysis to look at where are the most common locations of the users that are making these types of comments on platforms like 4chan. And we see that vast majority of them are from the United States. So this can have an impact on real communities that are living here, given that most of the people saying this are from the United States themselves. And so this actually, what we also did in conjunction with we did show how visually this is about Hindus and not just about Indians as a whole, but we also wanted to prove that quantitatively. So to do that, we did something in computational linguistics called vector subtraction. So to understand conceptually what that means is basically, let's say we have the word king and we subtract the word crown. What are we left with? We are left with man. So in the same way, when we have the word pajit, for instance, and you want to subtract the Hindu component from it, what are you left with? So if this wasn't about Hindus in particular, and let's say it's about Indians or some other kind of jokes that were taking place, you would see that the same tropes would be there when the Hindu component is removed. But now what we see is not that. When you remove the Hindu component from the word pajit, you see there are a whole bunch of fluff terms that really don't have any meaning. So stuff like telemarketing, AT&T, inexperienced, like none of these have anything to do with Hindus or Hinduphobia for that matter. There's no Hinduphobic tropes anywhere in this graph. So we see that this is very specifically targeted towards the Hindu community and not just about anti-Indian xenophobia or some other topic. And then we can take a look at a few other tweets that we identified on Twitter. So India is a genocidal Hindutva state. It's not at all like a Bollywood movie. Have Pakistanis really achieved freedom from Hindus while they practice Hindutva culture? Hindu people are beating and hurting Muslims in Delhi. Search the news about it. All of these actually look like, who do you think it could be? It's probably Pakistani users that are tweeting all of this, right? Well, that is wrong. This is not Pakistani users that are tweeting this. In fact, this is a state-sponsored information operation from Iran. And in this particular case, they're pretending to be authentic Pakistani users in the first two tweets. And then the last one is actually an Iranian state-sponsored troll pretending to be human rights activist, daughter of amazing parents, wife of gentleman, mother of two, sweetheart, employer of Human Rights Campaign Foundation, #resist. So we see that Iranian state-sponsored trolls are actually pretending to be authentic human rights activists and also Pakistani users to create divisions between Hindu and Muslim communities and inflame divisions between India and Pakistan. And so how did we identify that? We used these Twitter information operations data set from Twitter's information operations. They have several data sets about state-sponsored troll operations from Russia, China, Venezuela. Several other countries are also listed there. We did take a look at some of the other data sets, but the only one where we found anti-Hindu disinformation was from Iran. And so once again, we created a topic network of state-sponsored Iranian trolls and looking at the various tropes associated with Hindus. And we see that Hindus are always associated with extremists. Hindus are always disproportionately portrayed as violent and responsible for violence. And basically Iranian trolls use standard anti-Hindu disinformation to create divisions between Hindu and Muslim communities. And so when we actually took a look at where do these Iranian state-sponsored trolls actually set their locations to be, what we found is that vast majority of them are claiming to be from Pakistan. And when I say set their locations on Twitter, in our bios, there's a way for us to put down what location we are in. And Iranian state-sponsored trolls have put they're mostly in Pakistan, Lahore, Karachi, and vast majority of these do come from Pakistan. So we see that they're, once again, creating covert influence between these groups. And here's an example. So in 2017, there was a bombing by ISIS in India. And on that day, Iranian state-sponsored trolls who were pretending to be Pakistani basically then tweeted, guys, grab your keyboards and start trending #Hindu extremism to expose India. This is deliberately sowing disinformation as Hindus were not responsible for that terrorist attack, but in fact, the state-sponsored Iranian trolls were looking to create a disinformation campaign blaming Hindus. So in our conclusion and recommendations, we do show a systemic structure to anti-Hindu hatred using quantitative analysis, and modern manifestations of anti-Hindu disinformation share structural and dimensional similarity within white supremacist and Islamist circles. And this is on the rise in the modern cyber social space, whether it's state actors, fringe communities, or mainstream discourse. And Parth, if you want to add something that I've missed, please go ahead.
No, yeah, I wanted to just kind of underline the point that you were making about this dimensional symmetry within white supremacist and Islamist circles. So in case you missed it, we saw Pepe the Frog being used in all of these different memes that were very anti-Hindu, right? Basically calling for the genocide of Hindu people. And while these memes are produced by Islamist accounts, Pepe the Frog itself is a white supremacist meme, right? So we see that there's this growing synergy between these different extremist communities where they're sharing DNA, they're sharing information, they're borrowing from one another in terms of the medium of how they're going to disseminate different forms of bigotry, which is very dangerous in general for the world. And I think that's one of the main broad points that this kind of research also sheds light on.
Absolutely. And as for where this report itself is published, so this came out as a report from the Network Contagion Research Institute and also with the Miller Center. Rutgers University actually had a press release about this paper, and the Eagleton Institute of Politics also put this out. So thank you to everyone who did put this out, and also myself, Parth, and our advisor, Dr. Joel Finkelstein, have been on several media outlets, including NPR in California, and also WeOn, featured in a WeOn documentary to talk about this topic, Chitti Media and Times Now, and among several others. So you can view all of our talks, which I can drop in the chat after. But that's really it. So if you have any questions, please let us know. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me just check to see if there are questions here. Someone asked, is this out there? I think we have put together a few links so they can find that information. One question I do have for both of you guys is, what's next? What are you guys doing in terms of working on, kind of like educating people? I know we're working together on a few topics, but just kind of share that perspective.
Parth, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So already the NCRI has started work on other projects that build on the work that we did through this report. We want to stress that this report was foundational. It's not the full extent of Hinduphobia that we see online at all. So it doesn't cover everything. And it also doesn't go into the depth and the texture that we know, or that we believe we know exists online regarding Hinduphobia. So there is a lot of other work that's in the pipeline. I don't want to reveal what that is yet. We want you guys to be in suspense for a few more months before our next reports start coming out. So definitely do be on the lookout for that. I guess one thing I will say is that all of these, and this goes also back to what Induji was saying, is that these tropes that we're seeing online now, while they are taking on a different form, using memes from white nationalist communities like Pepe the Frog, borrowing from modern day events like we saw with the George Floyd meme, those things are new. But the what's actually being communicated substantively is not new. All these tropes that we saw, that Hindus are heretically evil, that Hindus are dirty, smelly, that Hindus are barbaric, that they're violent, all of these things have been in the public consciousness in one way or the other since at least the British times. So that's a really important point, I think, for our community to understand, is that this is not coming out of nowhere. This is something that is essentially being recycled from old tropes now being communicated through a new language on social media.
Yep. I think the question will be, how about an educational seminar for our community on how to properly leverage social media, tweets, hashtags, etc. The answer to that is yes, we will be hosting that. It's going to be coming up. Just a lot of things going on. We are also, just so everybody knows, on August 25th, we're going to be holding a congressional briefing on this report. So please look out for our flyer on that as well. That's coming up. So on August 25th, I think it's Thursday, August 25th, around 1:30 p.m. PST, 4:30 p.m. EST. So just look out for that. But yes, we will be doing that. Those are the only questions I see so far. Let's see.